This I've said from the beginning, there's a lot of positives to an NIW, right? Hi, and welcome back to Visa Vibes. I'm Stephen Brown. I'm a partner at Reddy Newman PC, and this week, a special guest that we talked to you about last week, we've got Ryan Wilk. He's one of our partners, and he has been leading our firm's efforts on national interest waivers and EB-1A. And, people had asked, we tell y'all, give us topics. Somebody said talk national interest waivers. So we've got the guy here. So, Ryan, thanks for joining.
Yeah, of course. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on, Stephen. Stephen said I guess I lead the drive, but I'm just the face at the top. We've got a great team, a lot of attorneys who work on these. So I hope to kind of give a framework of how to kind of think about these cases and maybe how we build cases. And, thanks for having me on, Stephen.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for those of you that don't know, we're going to talk about solely the National Interest Waiver today. This is an EB-2 category green card. You'll hear us refer to it as NIW. That's just, the abbreviation for it that we use. I don't even think I've heard us call it a National Interest Waiver in the office.
Too many words.
Yeah, so this is part of the EB-2 category. Typically, when we go through a perm-based EB-2, they have to have an employer sponsor, but you don't have to on the EB-2 NIW side. And so that is going to be a big selling point. One, you don't have to go through the perm process. We'll talk about that later. And then you can self-petition, and so it gives you some more flexibility. Now, our friends here that are Indian, Chinese nationals, and I guess everybody now, It doesn't get you out of that EB-2 backlog that exists, but we'll talk a little bit about the positives of this regardless. So, Ryan, why don't you start us off, though, the legal standard here for EB-2 NIW. What are adjudicators looking at? You file an I-140. What are you selling to them?
So what we're trying to do here is really show that the value of your work, and not necessarily you as an individual, but the work that you're engaged in, maybe we could think about your career path. How is that work nationally important? And so there's a few buzzwords. If you go out and kind of read the regulations and the statutes and the decisions, you're going to see a lot of similar phrases that pop out. And so one is this idea of a proposed endeavor. That's really the framework of your case. And so you truly really want to boil down what it is that you do as a profession and maybe to one or two sentences. So once we've got that idea of a proposed endeavor, and again, that's like the foundation of our case, the government wants to see that it has substantial merit, it has national importance, that you're well qualified to carry this out, and ultimately the value of this work outweighs the value of the protections given to U.S. workers through the labor certification process. And so we call this NIW, National Interest Waiver. It's a National Interest Waiver ... of the labor certification process. And so just as a quick background, there's typically 3 steps in a green card process: labor certification, Form I-140, and then the actual green card request. With this NIW, we're allowed to skip step 1. So we're just filing an I-140, requesting that they waive the labor certification. And then once that backlog for the green card is cleared, we'll take that 3rd step and finally file the 485.
Yeah, cool. So, again, we'll talk about kind of some of the benefits of this. But, I think it's interesting because when we talk about what is in the national interest, I think there's certain categories that are almost always there, and then some that kind of mature over time. What's the political climate? What's important to the government now? We saw a big push on AI. But I think when we talk about healthcare fields, that's typically national interest, depending on what you're doing.
Whenever I talk to clients, I try to get them to think in 2 minds. One, it doesn't necessarily have to be something, or you shouldn't necessarily posture your case as something that's touching on an area of national interest. That's certainly going to help. But a lot of times when you look through the decisions and the regulations and things, you're going to see a phrase called prospective positive impact upon the industry. And so when I build these cases, I do try to touch on some of those key points: national security, healthcare, AI, advancing technology, those sort of things. We really want to say, how does my proposed endeavor push something forward within my industry? And that's really where my eyes go when I'm developing these NIW cases.
Yeah, cool. So outside of that, what... I call you up today and I say, hey, I want to file an NIW. What is going through your mind when we have that first conversation as you kind of evaluate, is this a good case? Because ultimately we don't want to file something just to file it, right? We want to have a strong case. So what are you looking for when you do that?
I first want to see your resume, because that's going to tell me if you're even qualified for an EB-2. And then we do the NIW side of things. So for EB-2, you either have to have a master's degree or the equivalent of that under the regulations is a bachelor's degree and 5 years of experience. If you don't have either of those two, we can try to demonstrate to the government that you're an individual of exceptional ability. So it means you've got, I think there's 6 different prongs. I think we have to show 2 or 3. Forgive me for not remembering off the top of my head. But it's that you've got licensures, that you've maybe got a relevant area of study, you've got 10 years of experience, maybe you've got some publications and things like that. Now those aren't required. Most cases, these individuals are going to have either a master's degree or a bachelor's degree and 5 years of experience. That's where my eyes are going to go to first, because if you don't have either of those 2 things, we're just going to have an academic conversation. And then I'm going to look at your resume and I'm going to try to boil down the essence of what you do into 1 or 2 sentences. And why do I make it so elementary? Who's our audience? They're not engineers, they're not attorneys by any means. So I try to write to someone who has, a 12th grade reading equivalency education, so that we're trying to boil it down, make it easily understandable, not be overly technical. And so what I do, send me your resume. I'm going to give you, as my client, 3 to 5 ideas that I've come up with that I think I could support for the national importance, the substantial merit, and things like that. I want you, as the client, to be comfortable with what we're going to say on your behalf. On the other side of that coin, I have an idea of what we would be successful with. And so that's what I want to do, is I really want to look at your resume and see, okay, what buzzwords can we use that the government likes to see? What areas are you truly working in, so that then we can turn around and make the ideas of substantial merit, national importance, your ability to carry this job out, that much easier for us kind of from a tactical perspective.
All right, cool. And, again, I think it boils down to, and you mentioned this earlier, what is that impact going to be? And so, as we kind of talk about this, I've said from the beginning, there's a lot of positives to an NIW. And, when we've talked about NIW, we represent a lot of people from severely backlogged countries, and they're like, this doesn't help. I've got, I'm still stuck in EB-2, but, let me address, there's some things that are really good about doing an EB-2 NIW. And Ryan, feel free to chime in. I think the big one, not doing the perm labor certification, and that's not I want to avoid the labor market test. I don't think that is anything to do with it. It's this slow and uncertain process that perm is. I mean, perm is taking 18 months when we talk about the PWD and all that. For those of you that have just joined our podcast, we did a big episode on perm. Go listen to that. But when we talk about people who are maxing out, they need to maybe move quicker than 18 months in order to not have that issue. And so having that national interest waiver bypasses that, so it's faster.
On that idea, Stephen, so there's very few ways that we can self-petition a green card. And when I say self-petition, I mean we don't need an employer to sponsor us. Those perms, those labor certifications, they always, I should say always, but 99.999% of the time, have to be sponsored by someone willing to offer you a job. And so if you either want to divorce from that requirement and or don't want to have to go through that 2-year process of getting the labor certification done, NIW is probably your only answer if you do want to kind of continue on a green card path. And so another idea why might I do this whether I'm backlogged or not? Yes, you're divorcing yourself from the need to have an employer sponsor. You can get H-1B extensions based on your own NIW case. Maybe you're waiting on your employer. Maybe you do want your employer to be the sponsor of you. Maybe you're working for Meta and you love having that on your resume. That's great. But it might take them 2 or 3 years to get their labor certification done. It means it's going to take 2 or 3 years for you to get your priority date set. You can get your priority date set from an NIW case and carry that forward into a next petition. And so there's a lot of tactical ways that you can use an NIW that might not be the stepping stone that gets you the green card, but gets you into the spots that you need to be so that you're safeguarded, so that when it's finally time to file that 485, your life and your career progression in the United States hasn't been disturbed.
Yeah, and I think that was the next point I wanted to make, is the employer side. And it's, the employer driving the bus is great, but how many times have you and I had conversations with someone who, I'm partway through my perm process, my 6 years is up here in a few months, and I've been laid off, or I've had this issue, or they don't want to continue this process, whatever it might be, and that NIW divorces you from that. And you can certainly we've seen people who have had their company do their NIW, and there's nothing wrong with that, but when we talk about this 18-month process. And
people's own companies that they own do their NIW.
Yeah.
So I'm Ryan, I own XYZ consulting firm. I can have XYZ consulting firm file my NIW. It's still my company. I'm still the one driving the bus over there. And so that's certainly something to consider as well.
But yeah, I think, when you kind of divorce from the employer side, it gets rid of these variables that can happen. And we go back to, 2020, October 2020, the visa bulletin super, goes forward a ton. People who weren't thinking they've moved companies, they have approved I-140s with an old company, and now they need the new company to sponsor them, and I can't file my green card, I got to go through perm again. Having that NIW lets you leverage into that, without that step, even if you change. So more flexibility, you don't have to stick with the same employer. You can switch jobs. And I do think, going back to our topic from last week about entrepreneurs, this again kind of gives you more leverage. If you're, hey, I'm in this industry, I can get an NIW. When you do a perm-based I-140, it's for that job offer, right? Mm-hmm. And so having this NIW, again, you're taking control. So again, I think kind of it boils down to, and not everybody's going to qualify for an NIW, but to kind of put it into a short sentence, it's faster, gives you more flexibility, it empowers you as the individual to control your own immigration journey rather than being dependent.
And one thing I always say to a client, whether it's the strongest profile I've seen or the weakest, the one idea I try to get across is we're going to be creative here. Mm-hmm. And so even if maybe you have a weaker profile, we're going to be creative to see if we can build a case. If it's denied, it's not a black mark on your name. It just means they're not going to approve you for that I-140. Nothing prevents you from refiling a case. And so even if you think you might be on the fence, we've seen more often than not those on-the-fence cases be approved than not.
And it's interesting you say that. It's a big discussion in kind of the litigation universe that I do stuff in about, EB-1A denials, a lot easier to litigate. I mean, obviously the standard is high. But on an NIW, it's all about discretion. It's the attorney general in his discretion. That's how the INA is. It's a female attorney general.
Is going to be looking at these cases, but that's the way.
But yeah, it's written. So essentially, USCIS in their discretion can waive the labor certification requirement. And so that's what we're talking about here. And so when we talk about discretion, that prevents judicial review. We're talking about an EB-2 NIW, whereas an EB-1A denial is a little bit easier for me to get into court. But it is, you could be Johnny NIW. Everybody agrees you're in the national interest, but if that adjudicator doesn't agree, they don't have to exercise their discretion.
I'm going to give you a slight innocent correction there. When we look at these NIWs, I don't want us to look at me as Ryan, the candidate.
Yeah.
I want to say, what is the work that I do? No, I'm Ryan. I'm an immigration attorney that works on green cards. I could make that sound a lot fancier for building my own NIW case, but we don't focus on what Ryan Wilk as the individual does. What does someone in Ryan Wilk's seat? Ryan Wilk gets me. Good introduction again. What does Ryan Wilk? What does someone who sits in his seat do? And that's how we develop this idea of an NIW case, because the proposed endeavor is something that I should be able to do.
Right.
But it's an idea of what is going on in the industry and why is that idea of a proposed endeavor, why is that nationally important? Why does it have that prospective positive impact upon the industry?
Yeah, so Ryan, one of the things, we like to do on our podcast is hit a little myths. There's all sorts of myths in the immigration world. And so I'll go throw you some of these that I hear. Let me know your opinion. So one that I tend to hear, NIW is only for scientists and you got to have a PhD.
If that was the case, then I don't think I would have ever had a client. Or I've maybe had one or two doctors. The overwhelming, and I'm talking about 98% plus, normal everyday folks like you and I that have master's degrees, bachelor's degree, and some good degrees of experience. Now maybe these people have certificates in their profession, but if this was something that was limited to only the highest of the high, we call those EB-1s. These EB-2s are about what's your work, someone who sits in your chair, what's their work, and why is it important to the country? Cool.
Yeah, and next one I hear, and kind of on that line, is that, hey, I'm interested in NIW, but I don't have any published research or any patents. Can I still have a case for an NIW?
Absolutely. Again, that's more something that would be somewhat relevant, but not necessarily required for an EB-1A case. When we're talking about an NIW case, most of the case, when we build it, it's not going to focus on you as the individual. It's going to be focused on the proposed endeavor. Now, one of the prongs that we have to prove to the government is that you are well positioned to carry this forward. So maybe citations help, maybe publications help. But if essentially what I say to a client is if we're going to do an NIW, let's not develop an idea of the proposed endeavor as you as a veterinarian when your entire career has been as an accountant, right?
Yeah,
It just doesn't make sense. You can't add those two together. So as long as this proposed endeavor, and I would not be doing my job if your proposed endeavor was not in your career path. So when we're looking at what do I need to have in my background, no, you don't have to have citations. That would be helpful, but it's by no means a requirement.
Yeah, I think a lot of people tend to hear the two self-petitioning, the two primary self-petitioning, EB-1A, and EB-1B, and NIW, and kind of they're in the same universe. If you're listening to an immigration attorney, they sometimes talk about it in parallel because it's the self-petitioning.
We often see RFEs from the government talking about them in parallel. That's something we have to often push back on, where they'll say, okay, this is an NIW case, but we're going to need you to show us documentation of EB-1A, extraordinary ability.
Yeah.
We're quick to push back on them and remind them what's important and proper, and more often than not, we're going to get those approvals back.
Yes, I think we see a lot of that misconception construing, kind of confusing the two. The other myth I see, I've got to be in the U.S. and I have to be on H-1B status or working in order to apply for an NIW.
Not at all. If I was to explain to a client who knows nothing about immigration, I would say you can never have worked in the United States, never have stepped foot in the United States, and you can still file in an NIW case. Now, you might have to consular process your green card, which might take a little bit of time.
Yeah.
Nothing prevents you from doing an NIW case while you're abroad. I would say maybe 40% of our clients who are interested in the NIWs, because they're abroad, they see our shining hill, shining city upon the hill, and they want to be part of the club. Come to Ryan or come to Reddy Newman Brown, and we do their NIWs. But that other 60%, they're here and they've got their own immigration situations they're trying to sort through. Oftentimes, that NIW is the solution. Maybe it's not the long term, but certainly in a lot of times the short term solution.
So probably the last myth, premium processing we know was introduced for NIW cases, I think in 2023, somewhere around there. So you file my NIW tomorrow, I'm going to get my green card really quickly.
I wish that was the case. So one, and we could have our own podcast on the visa backlog. Right now, I would say every country in the world is backlogged under EB-2. China and India particularly are heavily affected by that backlog. So just getting the I-140 approved, the EB-2 NIW, just getting that approved, if your priority date's not current, you can't take that next step. But if it is, or if you're close, this is one way that you can put yourself, break off from the employer sponsor, and you're your own green card sponsor.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing. I mean, the NIW you're still EB-2, and that's got its own challenges, and just getting that I-140 approved isn't going to change that you're EB-2 or your country of chargeability, or anything like that.
Another point on the premium processing too, and from the kind of last few months of the Biden administration continuing into the Trump administration, we're starting to see USCIS let the premium processing clock lapse.
Yeah.
And so by the regulations, they should give us an approval or an RFE within 45 days of filing. 60% of the cases we're seeing right now, they're meeting those timelines. The other 40%, they're not. And so effectively, we're giving them a 2805 interest-free loan for a few years. Eventually they will. By law, they have to refund it to us if they don't hit the premium processing clock in time. And so legally, I have no problems at all with premium processing. They don't look at the cases any different. For me, it's more of an economic issue. Are we going to get the value of what we're paying for? If it's my $3,000, I'm maybe not going to put it in Tesla anytime soon. It's not doing too well, but maybe we'll do an inverse. But I think the money is better spent elsewhere, but that's more of Ryan being jaded on the economic side. Legally speaking, no problems at all with premium processing.
There's some adjudicators out there that have anonymously talked about there's just backlogs. I mean, more people are filing National Interest Waiver, EB-1A cases. Part of that is, increases in how they're looking at things. The Biden administration, hey, we're going to focus on AI, and that kind of opens some doors. And then the perm process, right, is kind of pushing more people to consider this option, where in the past they were thinking, well, I don't really need it, but now with perm taking almost 2 years. So with all that in mind, it is a good option. It's viable. I do think you should have your profile evaluated strongly. Don't just throw something out there. But it is, it's certainly out there. Ryan, anything to end, to close with?
So, kind of two things that. One of the things that I try to do is put the government's own words back in front of them when we're building these cases. And so, if you have a STEM degree, or if we can even reasonably color it as a STEM education, that gives you a bump up in this idea of national interest. Every year, I don't think Trump has come out with it yet, but they'll come out with what's called a critical and emerging technologies list, where they're going to identify industry sectors and kind of tech trends that the government is interested in leveraging. It's another way that we put forward, hey, if you're in AI and doing machine learning, here's the government telling us that it's nationally important. So there's a lot of ways that we can build this case. There's not a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah.
No, of course, I have my methodology, but the key here is being creative. And if you take this chance and you do get a denial, well, it's no loss. I mean, you paid some money to get the case taken a look at and things like that, but it's not going to set you back in terms of your immigration pathway by any means. If anything, if you're going to get the approval, that's a huge stepping stone that you can take for yourself, for your family, so that you can establish your permanent residency, get that green card here in the United States.
Cool. Ryan, appreciate you filling in for Emily today. Know you're the go-to guy here for us on national interest waivers. Thank you guys for listening. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I'm sure we're on other places that my marketing person will remind me of. And keep listening every week. And as we tell you every week, if you have any topics you want addressed, feel free to let us know, and we will incorporate them. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.